For this video, we're going to start the section by looking a little bit more at immigration, particularly between 1880 and 1914. During this time period, there will be a lot of shifts as far as what immigration looks like and who is immigrating into the United States. And of course, that has long-lasting impacts, particularly on the areas where you see that increase of immigration. So as far as immigration, one of the important things to keep in mind is that over the course of the 1880s, 90s, and into the 1900s, there will be a shift in immigration. Up until that point, many immigrants who had come into the United States had been coming from places like Ireland, England, and Germany. After the 1880s, you'll start to see an increase in immigrants who were coming from many different parts of the world. Very particularly, you'll start to see an increase in immigrants who were coming from different parts of Eastern Europe as well as from different parts of Asia, very particularly with China. I have a graphic in the PowerPoint for this week that helps to show this. It helps to show a little bit of the different ethnicities and how it might increase and or decrease over time. So, for example, we can see that just with Asia in general, there's going to be a massive increase here. So between 1870 and 1880, you'll see that it goes from around 64,000 to around 123,000. And of course, there are many other groups like this as well. So up here, just lists the USSR, but we can think more generally just Eastern Europe. That number is going to steadily increase as well. And with this, we have to understand that for many people in the United States, there have always been issues with having immigrants coming from different nations. So over the course of the earlier 1800s, as you start to see an increase of immigrants from places like Germany, or even just immigrants from places like Ireland or England, there is going to be this sort of stigma that is put on a lot of these immigrants, particularly with groups of people like the Irish. They are going to have a different understanding of Christianity, so many of them would have been Catholic as opposed to Protestant. They might have a different way of life, a different culture, different cuisines that they would enjoy eating. And because of that, they're seen as being different. And oftentimes they will be sort of looked down upon by society. By the time you get to the 1880s and all the way through the 1900s, many of these earlier immigrants who were coming in the 1800s, they have become in a sense, more naturalized U.S. citizens. So a lot of their offspring, their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, they have sort of adopted a more American way of life. Some of them might have married into families that were long established. They've probably started to lose their accent. They've adopted American ways. And because of that, they really start to see themselves more as Americans as opposed to the family of immigrants. With this new wave of immigrants, however, we will see that the earlier immigrants will start to put a stigma onto these new immigrants because, again, they're going to be a bit different. So what I have here is actually going to be a graph of immigration in the United States. I'm going to drag this back to 1820, where we start to see this information coming in. A couple of things that I'd like for you to keep your eye on would, of course, be places like Ireland. We'll see a jump with Irish immigration. You have the German immigration right here. And of course, I think it's also important to look at Central and Eastern Europe as well as Asia. So I'm going to pause it here so we can just sort of look at this for just a second. But as far as immigration, we can see that for places like Ireland, there's going to be a significant spike that takes place because of things like the potato famine. Same with Germany. We can see there's going to be a spike over the course of the 1800s, sort of leveling out a bit more there. But as far as Central Europe and Eastern Europe, we can see that over the course of the 1870s, we're starting to see this rise. So we'll continue to keep an eye on this lighter blue line right here. And then also we'll keep an eye on some of these other ones as well. So we can see a little bit of a rise here with Asia as well. So we'll continue to watch this play out. So here is what we are looking at by the time you get to 1919. So again, here what we can see is that the Central and Eastern Europe section is going to absolutely start to explode. Over here, of course, you can see your immigration in millions. We will see that places like Italy also have record numbers coming into the United States. As far as Asia, There is going to be a bit of an increase here, again, leveling out over here as well. We'll talk more later about the idea of not just nativism, but things like the Chinese Exclusion Acts and how that might impact various groups coming from places like China as well. But with this, hopefully you can see how this skyrockets, particularly here. And now we're going to sort of think about the impact this might have on the American people, as well as the immigrants who are coming in. For many of the immigrants who were coming into the United States, particularly from different parts of Europe, chances are good that they would have entered into a facility, most likely Ellis Island in New York. As far as Ellis Island in New York, this is going to be the sort of central hub where people are going to come into the United States for the first time. When they get into Ellis Island, they are going to depart from the ships that they were on. The ships that they had been on were likely very crowded. We can see that with these ships, they are going to sell tickets for a relatively cheap price, and because of that, sometimes there are people who barely have a place to sleep on these ships. They don't necessarily have adequate food, but they're willing to do whatever it takes to get to the United States. A lot of people are trying to escape from poverty. They are escaping from famine. These are what we oftentimes, we'll talk about it more in just a second, we refer to as push factors. It's not necessarily always just they want to get to this land of freedom and opportunity, but sometimes they feel that they have no choice. They no longer have the ability to live where they are living and to live and take care of their families. So here again, you can sort of see a picture of some immigrants who are departing as far as Ellis Island once they would have come inside. And they actually still have this set up today so that if you do ever visit New York and you go visit something like the Statue of Liberty, you also have the option of visiting Ellis Island, the actual places where they held people. But what they would do is people would sort of come through and they would be asked a lot of questions. They would eventually be observed. And when they were observed, they're looking for anyone that they think might be sick. They're looking for people who might not be what they might consider to be productive members of society. So anyone who might have any sort of disability of any kind. They're also looking for people who they believe could potentially be extremists. So even at this early point in the 1900s and the late 1800s, you're starting to see different political ideas surfacing in Europe. So if they were concerned that someone might be too radical or something, then they might even end up sort of detaining this person and holding them. Now, once people are able to adequately answer these questions, they would then be sent out of the sort of holding area so that they could be processed into the United States. If they did not pass these tests, if they couldn't answer the questions properly, then they could also be sent back exactly to where they came from. So for some people, they might make it to Ellis Island and then they can't make it back. Something else they oftentimes looked for was, do you have someone who can vouch for you? If you had a distant family member, a close family member, even if you just had a friend of a friend who lived in the United States, that could be someone who could help vouch for you. It meant that you had someone who could help you to find a place to live, to find a place to work, and oftentimes it would make your ability to get into the United States far easier than if you were the first of your family or the first of your sort of friend group to make it into the United States. And of course, that is going to be when we are thinking about the sort of Eastern Shoreboard. The West Coast also had what is known as Angel Island. So there was a U.S. immigration station there as well. And people would go through a very similar process. Again, here you can see a picture of people being examined before they are let into the nation. Over time, however, we can see that the immigration into the West Coast is going to slow down significantly, particularly with immigrants coming from places like China. And a lot of that has to do with different things like the increase in nativism and the increase in people who do not want to have immigrants from Asia in the United States. We'll talk more about that in just a second. As far as adjusting, particularly if we think about the East Coast, and these cities, we will see that there are going to be a couple of commonalities we have to keep in mind. First and foremost, a lot of settlers are going to create what becomes known as chain migrations. An example of the impact of chain migration might be something like Little Italy. As you saw on that graph we looked at, there is going to be a strong increase in Italian immigrants, or it might be something like a Chinatown, and you see those in various parts of larger cities along the eastern coast as well as along the western coast. And with these various types of chain migration, the idea is that if one family member, so say that a father is able to get to the United States, he would hopefully be able to find a job, to be able to work, and to send money back home so that more family members might be able to come in the future. In addition to that, once those family members come, they continue to work, and the idea is that eventually you can get a whole family over. You see that some towns are also going to work together to get as many people from that town to the United States as possible. So with this chain migration, one sort of example that I think is pretty telling is for the Germans. Milwaukee ends up becoming their sort of haven, and you start to see a lot of Germans coming to that area. Now, as far as adjustment, it's different for different groups. People who can sort of speak English and fit into American society very quickly. Maybe people from places like England. Later on, you'll see maybe Ireland, although, of course, their Catholicism does also keep them somewhat excluded. But they might have a better time adjusting than, say, a group of people like people who are coming from Eastern Europe. Maybe they don't practice the same form of Christianity. They speak a different language. And because of that, it's going to lead to a different type of adjustment and adjustment period. As far as a lot of these areas, we can also see that they are going to create their own churches, their own newspapers, and that becomes very important. So for a lot of them, they don't have to necessarily learn how to speak English immediately, because the jobs that they have, as we discussed in a previous video, are oftentimes going to be more unskilled labor positions in factories. And so long as someone can communicate with them and just tell them how to perform the job, they would be able to do so without having to communicate too much among themselves or with anyone else. But of course, again, the important thing here is also that there is this new hostility that comes towards these different groups of immigrants. I think that one thing that's really important for this particular part of American history are going to be the political cartoons that are created. And we'll talk a lot about those when we get to the section on American imperialism, because it's one way that various newspapers are going to communicate with their constituents, the people that are reading their paper. But I wanted to look at a couple of different political cartoons here. So the first one here, this is from 1871, and the name of the cartoon is going to be, quote, "The Chinese Question," end quote. So here, what you can hopefully see is this woman, potentially, she is supposed to be representative of maybe a Lady Liberty type of figure, and she is helping to protect a Chinese immigrant here. I think what's important is that over here, you are going to have men with a lot of potentially like weapons that are going to try to come in and to attack. Maybe they're trying to get rid of this Chinese man. It's kind of assumed here, based on the way that they're dressed, that these are probably going to be immigrants who are maybe Irish, potentially Scottish or English or something like that as well. But here we can see, again, the idea is that they're trying to figure out what to do with the Chinese. So they're referred to as Chinese barbarians. We can see here they're also referred to as heathens, trying to sort of vilify the Chinese. Over here, they are the vilest of the human race. And so with that, we can see here that there's this idea that, again, this Lady Liberty figure is trying to maybe protect this immigrant, to give them this sort of refuge that would be expected for a place like the United States that was built on immigrants coming in the first place. The next political cartoon here, this is going to be the anti-Chinese wall cartoon. With this particular cartoon, I think that, it's important to take a second to see if you can break this down for yourself. But we can see many different groups that are here. And according to the caption, this again being from the Library of Congress, we can see here this is a cartoon showing laborers, among whom are the Irishman, an African American, a Civil War veteran, an Italian, a Frenchman, and a Jew building a wall against the Chinese. Of course, they're carrying their own blocks. We can see things like laws against race, jealousy. There are a couple that say fear over here as well. And the congressional mortar, which is right here, is used to help mount blocks of prejudice, non-reciprocity, laws against race, fear, and so on. Across the sea, there is a ship flying the American flag that is entering China as the Chinese knock down their own wall to permit the trade of goods such as rice and tea. So with this, there's a lot, of course, that you could break down here. But again, there were a lot of people who were very much against immigration. There were people who maybe spoke out against the hypocrisy of Americans being against this immigration. But as a whole, I think it's important to note that there is this issue of sort of racism against many different groups. With this, we can see that there is a rise in nativism. When we think about nativism, this is going to be a sort of pride that is created among people who were born in the United States and consider themselves to be U.S. citizens, and they are very much against having any number of immigrants coming into the U.S. We can see that for people who did come into the U.S. or their families had come, oftentimes they sort of lose sight of that idea of themselves having once been immigrants or part of immigrant families, and instead very much focusing on the sort of concept and the idea that they are different somehow. Now, with this, I think that it's important to, of course, note that for these immigrants, again, many of them are going to be working very low-paying jobs, and the conditions they end up facing end up being very, very abysmal, but we will talk about that more in a later video.